The pre-dawn darkness over Tinian Island hung thick and humid, broken only by the rhythmic flash of runway lights stretching into the Pacific night. March 1945. The war was bleeding Japan dry, city by city, and tonight would be no different. Captain James, Jim, Cartwright stood beneath the nose of his B-29 superfortress, Devil's Daughter, running his hand along the cold aluminum skin. 28 missions. 28 times he'd taken this four-engine giant up into the freezing stratosphere and brought her home. The bomber towered above him, 99 feet of wingspan, 141 feet of length, 4 Wright R-3350 Cyclone engines capable of pushing 2,200 horsepower each. She was beautiful. She was deadly. And tonight, she would carry 12 tons of incendiary bombs into the heart of Nagoya. Captain. The voice belonged to Lieutenant Robert Hayes, his co-pilot, 22 years old with hands that never stopped shaking before a mission but steadied the moment they touched the controls. Briefings in 10. Jim nodded, his eyes still on the aircraft. The B-29 wasn't just a bomber. She was a technological marvel, a pressurized cabin that allowed crews to operate at 30,000 feet without bulky oxygen masks, remote-controlled gun turrets, a sophisticated autopilot system. But she was also temperamental. The engines ran hot, often caught fire. The pressurization system was complex, prone to failure. And if something went wrong at altitude, you had minutes, sometimes seconds, to make decisions that meant life or death. Inside the operations tent, Major Kellerman stood before a map of Japan, red lines marking their route. Gentlemen, target is the Mitsubishi aircraft plant in Nagoya. We're expecting heavy flak over the city and fighter opposition all the way in and out. You'll climb to 28,000 feet, maintain formation, drop on the lead bombardier's mark, and get the hell home. Jim studied the map. Nagoya. Industrial heart. Heavily defended. The Japanese knew the B-29s were coming now. They always knew. And they were getting better at stopping them. Weather? Someone asked. Clear over target. Winds from the west at 40 knots at altitude. Moon's 3/4 full. They'll see us coming. Kellerman's eyes swept the room. Questions. Silence. They all knew what questions to ask. They also knew the answers wouldn't change anything. 30 minutes later, Devil's Daughter sat at the end of the runway, engines roaring, the entire airframe vibrating with barely contained power. Jim's crew was strapped in, Hayes in the right seat, Flight Engineer Sergeant Mike Palmer behind them monitoring the jungle of gauges and switches, Navigator Lieutenant Donald Pierce hunched over his charts in the nose, Bombardier Lieutenant Carl Mitchum beside him, and the gunners scattered throughout the pressurized compartments. Radio Operator Sergeant Tommy Rizzo, and Gunner Staff Sergeant Eddie Kowalski, Corporal James, Jr., Washington, Sergeant Frank DeLuca, and Tail Gunner Sergeant Raymond Ray Bishop. 11 men. 1 aircraft. 7 hours in enemy skies. Tower, this is Devil's Daughter, ready for takeoff, Jim said into his mic. Devil's Daughter, you are cleared. Godspeed. Jim pushed the throttles forward. The 4 engines screamed. The B-29 began to roll, slowly at first, then faster, the runway lights blurring past. 140,000 pounds of aircraft, fuel, and bombs accelerating into the darkness. At 120 miles per hour, Jim pulled back on the yoke. The nose lifted. The main gear followed. And Devil's Daughter climbed into the starlit sky, one of 287 bombers converging on Japan. Inside the pressurized cabin, the temperature was comfortable, around 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside, at altitude, it would drop to 50 below zero. But they wouldn't feel it. Not unless something went wrong. Jim leveled off at 8,000 feet, joining the formation. Behind them, bomber after bomber rose from Tinian, Saipan, and Guam, a river of silver aircraft flowing north toward the Empire. The drone of 1,148 engines filled the night. Formation's looking good, Captain, Hayes said. Jim scanned the darkness. He could see the navigation lights of the bombers around them, holding position. They would climb together, cross the 1,500 miles to Japan together, face whatever waited together. The B-29 was designed for high-altitude precision bombing. Get above the flak, drop with accuracy, come home. But lately, General LeMay had changed tactics. Lower altitudes, night raids, firebombing. The cities were burning, and the Japanese were paying in blood and ash. Beginning climb to mission altitude, Jim announced. The nose tilted upward. The engines strained. Slowly, steadily, Devil's Daughter ascended through 10,000 feet, then 15,000, then 20,000. At 22,000 feet, the pressurization system kicked into full operation, maintaining sea-level pressure inside while outside the air grew thin and deadly. At 25,000 feet, Sergeant Palmer called out, oxygen system green across the board. Pressurization holding steady. All engines nominal. Copy that, Jim replied. But something felt wrong. Call it instinct. Call it 28 missions worth of knowing when the odds were stacked wrong. Jim couldn't see it yet, couldn't name it. But somewhere in the night ahead, something was waiting. They crossed the coastline of Japan at 28,000 feet. Below, the islands were dark except for scattered lights, blacked out against the bombers but not quite invisible. The moon painted the clouds silver. Enemy coast, Pierce announced. We're over Honshu. And that's when the radio crackled with the first warning. Bandits. Bandits at 10 o'clock high. Japanese fighters. Coming in fast. The first burst of 20mm cannon fire lit up the night like lightning, tracers arcing across the darkness in streams of red and orange. Jim yanked the yoke left, throwing Devil's Daughter into a shallow bank as the formation scattered, a deadly ballet of massive bombers trying to evade fighters designed for one thing, killing them. Fighters closing fast. Eddie Kowalski's voice crackled from the upper turret, his twin .50 caliber machine guns already hammering. The sound reverberated through the fuselage, a metallic thunder that shook teeth and nerves. Jim could see them now, dark silhouettes against the moonlit clouds, closing at impossible speeds. Key 61 Tonys, most likely, or the newer Key 84 Franks. Fast, agile, and flown by pilots who knew they were defending their homeland. They came in high and fast, diving through the formation, cannons blazing, then breaking away before the bombers' defensive fire could track them. Fighter 6 o'clock. Ray Bishop screamed from the tail position. His guns roared. Empty brass casings tumbled through the tail section like deadly rain. Jim held the aircraft steady, fighting every instinct to jink and weave. At this altitude, with this weight, Devil's Daughter couldn't dogfight. She could only absorb punishment and trust that her crew could dish out enough to make the fighters think twice. Another fighter flashed past, so close Jim could see the red circles on its wings. Cannon rounds hammered into the right wing, punching through aluminum like paper. The aircraft shuddered. Right wing hit, Palmer shouted, eyes scanning his panel. No fire, no fuel leak. We're still good. Bandits breaking off, Kowalski reported. They're regrouping for another pass. Jim glanced at the formation. It was ragged now, bombers scattered across several thousand feet of sky, some trailing smoke, one falling away with an engine on fire, a comet of flame dropping toward the dark earth below. No parachutes. Too fast, too sudden. Navigator, how long to target? Jim asked, his voice steady despite the chaos. 18 minutes to initial point, Pierce responded. We're on course. 18 minutes. 18 minutes of being hunted at 28,000 feet, where the air was so thin that a depressurization would give them maybe 30 seconds before hypoxia turned their brains to mush. The fighters came again. This time they came from ahead, boring straight into the formation, head-on attacks that required insane courage or absolute desperation. Probably both. The B-29's nose guns opened up, the .50 calibers adding their voice to the symphony of violence. One fighter exploded in midair, a brief orange flower that faded to falling debris. Another staggered, trailing smoke, but kept coming. "He's not pulling out," Hayes yelled. The Ki-61 drove straight at them, cannons firing, the pilot visible in his cockpit for just a fraction of a second before. The fighter's left wing clipped Devil's Daughter's No. 3 engine nacelle. The impact sounded like a gigantic hammer striking an anvil. The B-29 bucked violently. Warning lights blazed across the instrument panel like a Christmas tree of death. Jesus Christ! Palmer grabbed his console. No. 3 engine destroyed. Fire warning. Pressurization failure. We're losing pressure fast. Jim's hands flew across the controls. Feather 3. Deploy fire suppression. Hayes was already moving, pulling the engine's feather lever, cutting fuel, activating the fire extinguisher. The propeller blades rotated to their streamlined position, and the fire warning light flickered, held, then went dark. But the pressurization warning was still screaming. "Where's the leak?" Jim demanded. Palmer's eyes swept the gauges, then went wide. "Bomb bay. And, oh God, Captain, the central oxygen system. It's gone. The collision severed the main oxygen lines. We're bleeding compressed oxygen into the bomb bay." Time stopped. The B-29's pressurization system was revolutionary, but it depended on a complex network of oxygen lines, regulators, and compressors. If those lines were damaged, if they were destroyed, then the pressurized cabin became a death trap. The thin air at 28,000 feet contained only about one-third the oxygen available at sea level. Without supplemental oxygen, useful consciousness lasted 2 to 3 minutes. Death came shortly after. "Can you seal it?" Jim asked, already knowing the answer. "Negative. The damage is too extensive. We're at 28,000 feet with no oxygen system and a pressurization leak we can't stop." "Captain." Palmer's voice cracked. "We've got maybe 5 minutes before this cabin is at outside pressure. And we've got no oxygen to breathe when it happens." Jim's mind raced. Drop the bombs now, dive to lower altitude, below 10,000 feet where oxygen wasn't mandatory. But they were still 15 minutes from target, and diving would mean breaking formation, becoming a lone bomber, easy prey for the fighters that were even now circling for another attack. "Emergency oxygen bottles?" Hayes asked. "Walk-around bottles for emergencies," Palmer replied. "Maybe 20 minutes of oxygen total for the whole crew. Not enough to get us to target and home." The radio erupted with chatter, other bombers reporting damage, fighters everywhere, and underneath it all, the steady voice of the mission commander. "All aircraft maintain formation. Proceed to target. Repeat, all aircraft proceed to target." Jim looked at Hayes. The young lieutenant's face was pale, his eyes asking the question nobody wanted to voice. Do we abort? But aborting meant turning back alone. Meant leaving the formation's protective firepower. Meant fighters would swarm them like sharks on a wounded fish. And it meant 28 missions of bringing his crew home safely would end with them drowning in their own useless lungs at 28,000 feet. "How long until we reach lower altitude if we dive now?" Jim asked. Pierce did the math. At maximum descent rate, 10 minutes to 10,000 feet. "But Captain, the fighters will tear us apart if we leave the formation." Another burst of cannon fire raked the formation. A B-29 to their left shuddered, its tail section suddenly gone, torn away by a direct hit. The aircraft nosed over and began the long fall. "Captain, we have to decide," Hayes pressed. "Pressure's dropping. We're at 23,000 feet equivalent cabin altitude and falling." Jim's hand tightened on the yoke. 28 missions. 28 times he'd made the right call. Every time he'd chosen the option that brought his crew home. But this time, there was no right call. Only choices between different ways to die. "We continue to target," Jim said quietly. "Flight engineer, distribute every walk-around oxygen bottle in the aircraft. Ration them. We'll share. We'll take turns. We'll make it work, Captain." "We make it work, Sergeant. Because if we break formation now, we're dead. If we stay in formation without oxygen, we might make it. Those are the only options." Hayes stared at him, then, slowly, nodded. "All crew, this is the captain," Jim said into the intercom. "We've lost our oxygen system. We're going to share emergency bottles and continue to target. I need everyone sharp, everyone watching for signs of hypoxia in themselves and each other. We look out for our brothers. We bring this bird home." "Understood." One by one, acknowledgments came back. Scared voices. Young voices. But steady voices. The cabin pressure continued to drop. The air grew thin. And ahead, through the darkness, the lights of Nagoya began to appear. They were 15 minutes from target. 15 minutes from releasing their bombs. And then they'd have to survive the 3-hour flight home. Without oxygen. At altitude. While Japanese fighters hunted them. The cabin altitude gauge read 24,000 feet and climbing. Outside, the actual altitude was still 28,000 feet. The difference was academic. Either way, the air was too thin to sustain human consciousness for long. Sergeant Palmer moved through the aircraft, distributing the portable oxygen bottles, small green cylinders with rubber masks attached. There were 8 bottles total. 11 men. Maybe 20 minutes of oxygen per bottle if used conservatively. Call it 160 minutes total, divided 11 ways. 14 minutes per man. They needed 3 hours minimum to get home. The math was impossible. "Captain, I'm starting to feel it," Hayes said, his words slightly slurred. "Headache. Fingers tingling." Jim felt it too. The first insidious whisper of hypoxia, the silent killer that made you feel drunk, happy, stupid just before it killed you. Your body didn't trigger panic. It just faded. Pilots had been known to carefully remove their oxygen masks at altitude, convinced they didn't need them, smiling as they died. "Take oxygen," Jim ordered. 2 minutes, then pass the bottle. Hayes pressed the mask to his face, breathing deeply. The gauge on the bottle ticked downward. Over the intercom, Jim could hear the crew breathing, harsh, labored. Someone was humming, not quite in tune. A bad sign. The euphoria of hypoxia setting in. "Junior, you okay?" Eddie Kowalski's voice, tight with concern. "I'm fine, man. I'm fine. Everything's funny, you know?" James Washington's laugh was high-pitched, wrong. "Junior's hypoxic," Eddie reported. "Getting him on oxygen now." "Bandits, 3 o'clock level." Ray Bishop's voice from the tail, still sharp. The tail gunner had one of the bottles, was using it in controlled bursts. The fighters were back. They came in from the side this time, a line of 4 key 84 Franks, their engines screaming. The B-29 formation tightened instinctively, overlapping fields of fire creating a wall of lead. The fighters opened up at 1,000 yards, their 20mm cannons sending tracers dancing through the night. Devil's Daughter shook as rounds walked up her fuselage. Somewhere behind Jim, metal screamed. The aircraft yawed left. "We're hit." "Left stabilizer." Palmer shouted, fighting to maintain control of the oxygen distribution while the world went crazy around him. Jim corrected with rudder, feeling the aircraft's response, sluggish, wounded, but still flying. "How bad?" "Control surface damage. We can compensate." But they couldn't compensate for the lack of oxygen. "Target in sight," Mitchum called from the bombardier's position. Through the darkness ahead, Nagoya sprawled beneath them, a constellation of lights that shouldn't have been visible but were, because despite the blackout orders, you couldn't hide a city of over 1 million people. Searchlights snapped on, brilliant white columns reaching into the sky, sweeping back and forth, hunting. When they found a bomber, the anti-aircraft guns would follow. "Beginning bomb run," Jim announced. "Steady. Steady." This was the worst part. The bomb run required flying straight and level, no evasion, no matter what the enemy threw at you. You became a target, a slow-moving bullseye at 200 miles per hour, while 88mm flak guns tried to swat you from the sky. The first flak burst appeared off the right wing, a black flower of smoke and shrapnel that blossomed and faded in seconds. Then another. Then 10 more, a garden of death blooming around them. Crack, crack. The sound of shrapnel hitting aluminum. "Flak damage right wing," Kowalski reported. Still flying. Jim's vision was starting to tunnel. Gray creeping in at the edges. He blinked hard, shook his head. The oxygen bottle was with Hayes, who was passing it to Palmer. 40 seconds until it came back to him. 40 seconds might as well be 40 years. "Captain." Hayes's voice sounded far away. "You need oxygen. Now." "After the drop," Jim forced out. "Hold course." The aircraft bucked through a flak burst. Something hit the windscreen with a metallic ping, a chunk of shrapnel that left a star-shaped crack in the thick glass. "Bombs away in 30 seconds, Mitchum said, his voice the only calm thing in the universe. 20 seconds. 10 seconds. More flak. A bomber to their right took a direct hit, its entire midsection exploding outward, the two halves of the aircraft tumbling away separately, men falling like rag dolls into the darkness. Bombs away. The B-29 lurched upward as 12 tons of incendiaries dropped free, tumbling down toward the Mitsubishi plant below. All around them, other bombers were releasing, a rain of fire falling on Nagoya. "Direct hit," Mitchum confirmed. "Factory complex is lit up. Get us out of here." Palmer pressed the oxygen bottle into Jim's hands. Jim took 3 deep breaths, felt the fog lift slightly, and banked Devil's Daughter away from the target. The formation began its turn, heading south, heading home. But the fighters were waiting. They came out of the moon, a swarm of them, more than Jim had ever seen. 10, 15, maybe 20 fighters, every aircraft the Japanese could throw at the bombers now that they were leaving the target area and formation discipline was breaking down. "They're everywhere," Ray Bishop screamed, his guns hammering. I can't get them all." Cannon fire ripped into Devil's Daughter from multiple directions. The entire aircraft shuddered. Warning lights exploded across the panel. Number 4 engine hit. Losing oil pressure. Palmer's hands flew across controls. Feathering 4. 2 engines down now. The B-29 slowed, began falling behind the formation. "We're losing airspeed," Hayes said, his words thick. He'd given up his oxygen turn to help Palmer. Now hypoxia was taking him. "Captain, I can't feel my hands." "Hayes, oxygen. Now." Jim grabbed the bottle from Pierce, shoved it at his co-pilot. But while he was doing that, no one was flying the aircraft. Devil's Daughter nosed down, starting into a shallow dive. The airspeed increased. 220 miles per hour. 230. The aircraft was heavy, wounded, and gravity was winning. Jim grabbed the yoke, pulled back. The aircraft responded sluggishly. They were at 26,000 feet now. Descending. "Let her fall," Pierce said suddenly, his navigator's mind cutting through the chaos. "Captain, let her fall. Get us below 10,000 feet. We can breathe down there. We can survive down there. The fighters will follow us down, yes. But we're dead anyway if we stay at altitude. We've got maybe 5 minutes of oxygen left total. The formation is leaving us behind. We're on our own either way." Jim looked at his crew. Hayes, barely conscious, sucking oxygen from a nearly empty bottle. Palmer, gray-faced, hands shaking. The gunners in back, some of them already non-responsive over the intercom. Decision time. Again. "All crew, brace for emergency descent. We're going down. Fast." Jim pushed the yoke forward. The nose dropped. The airspeed increased rapidly. 250 miles per hour. 270. 290. The two remaining engines screamed. The aircraft began to vibrate, the damaged control surfaces protesting. The altimeter unwound like a stopwatch counting down to 0. 25,000 feet. A fighter followed them down, guns blazing, but the increased speed made them a harder target. Tracer rounds streaked past. 20,000 feet. The cabin pressure was equalizing now, outside and inside becoming the same thin atmosphere. But they were descending fast enough that the air was getting richer with every second. 15,000 feet. "I can breathe," Hayes gasped. "I can breathe." 12,000 feet. The vibration was worse now, the aircraft on the edge of structural failure. Jim eased back on the yoke, bleeding off speed, shallowing the dive. 10,000 feet. "Level off! Level off!" Palmer shouted. Jim pulled back harder. The G-forces pushed him into his seat. The aircraft groaned, metal complaining. But she responded. The nose came up. The dive flattened. 9,500 feet. Level flight. The air was thick, blessed, breathable. Jim sucked it in, his head clearing, feeling returning to his extremities. "Crew check in," he ordered. "Everyone report." One by one they called in. Junior was unconscious but breathing, hypoxia-induced blackout. Frank DeLuca had vomited, was disoriented, but alive. Everyone else was functional, or close enough. But they were at 9,500 feet, 100 miles inside Japanese airspace, with 2 engines out, structural damage to the tail and wings, and fighters still circling above, deciding whether to follow the wounded bomber down. "Navigator, give me a course for home," Jim said. Pierce bent over his charts, his hands still shaking. "Heading 185. Distance to Tinian, roughly 1,200 miles. At current airspeed, just over 6 hours. 6 hours. Through enemy territory. At low altitude. On 2 engines. With a damaged aircraft." Through the window, Jim saw the first fighter begin its dive toward them. 6 hours. If they lived the next 6 minutes. The key, 84 Frank, came screaming down out of the darkness like a falcon stooping on prey. Ray Bishop saw it first, called it out, swung his twin .50s around. The fighter opened fire at 600 yards, and Bishop fired back, a stream of tracers reaching out toward the diving Japanese aircraft. For 3 eternal seconds, the 2 streams of fire converged, crossed, found their targets. The fighter's canopy shattered. The aircraft jinked hard right, trailing smoke, and screamed past Devil's Daughter's tail so close that Ray could see the pilot slumped in his cockpit. "Got him! The bastard's going down!" Ray's voice cracked with exhaustion and desperate triumph. But 2 more fighters were descending now, and at 9,500 feet, Devil's Daughter was in their territory, low enough that the Japanese could take their time, make multiple passes, coordinate their attacks. "Can we go lower?" Jim asked. "Get down in the weeds, make it harder for them?" Palmer shook his head. "We're barely maintaining altitude on 2 engines with this much damage. Go lower and we might not be able to climb again. And the Japanese islands are mountainous. We need at least 5,000 feet clearance to cross safely." Trapped. Too low to run, too high to hide, too damaged to fight effectively. The next fighter came in from 5 o'clock low, a textbook attack angle that brought him up under the tail where Bishop's guns couldn't depress far enough to track him. The pilot knew exactly what he was doing. "Can't get him! Can't get him!" Ray shouted. But Eddie Kowalski could. The belly turret swiveled, the remote-controlled guns tracking smoothly. Eddie waited, let the fighter close to 400 yards, then pressed the trigger. The twin .50 calibers roared. The fighter's left wing root erupted in flames. The aircraft rolled inverted and fell away, spinning, burning. "That's two," Eddie called out. But cannon rounds from the second fighter stitched across Devil's Daughter's left wing, punching through the fuel tanks. Gasoline vented, streaming behind them in a mist that caught the moonlight. "Fuel leak, left wing." Palmer's voice was tight. "We're losing fuel fast. Captain, at this rate we won't make it halfway home." Jim's mind raced through the options. Ditch in the ocean? The B-29 wasn't designed for water landings. She'd break apart on impact. Try to reach Iwo Jima? The Marines had just taken it a few weeks ago. But Iwo was still over 700 miles away, and they'd never make it on their remaining fuel with the leak. "Can we seal the tanks?" Hayes asked. "Negative. The self-sealing fuel bladders are torn to shit. We're just bleeding out." The radio crackled. Any station, this is Playmate 47 declaring emergency. 2 engines out, structural damage, multiple casualties. Descending through 8,000 feet. Position. Static. Then silence. Another bomber dying in the darkness. Another crew facing the same impossible odds. Jim keyed his own mic. "Any station, this is Devil's Daughter. We are at Angels 9, heading 185 for home base. 2 engines out, severe battle damage, fuel leak. Request any available assistance." The radio hissed. Then, "Devil's Daughter, this is Fiddler on guard. We copy your emergency. Be advised, Navy has been notified. Submarine pickets are on station along your route. If you go down, they'll be looking for you. Good luck. If you go down. When you go down." The third fighter made its pass, and this time they weren't fast enough. Cannon shells walked up the right side of the fuselage, punching through aluminum, through equipment, through the compartment where Junior Washington was just regaining consciousness. The scream over the intercom was brief, cut off suddenly. "Junior's hit! Junior's hit!" Eddie's voice, raw with panic. "How bad?" Jim demanded. A pause. Then, "He's gone, Captain. He's gone. The first one." In 28 missions, Jim had never lost a crew member. Never. The weight of it hit him like a physical blow. James Washington, 20 years old, from Detroit, who'd been humming Ella Fitzgerald songs during the climb to altitude. Dead. Killed by shrapnel at 9,500 feet over the Pacific because Jim had made the decision to continue the mission instead of aborting. "Captain." Hayes's voice was quiet. "Captain, stay with us. We need you." Jim blinked, forced his mind back to the present. Grief later. Survival now. "Roger. How's our fuel?" "Leak's slowing," Palmer reported. "I think the fuel level is below the punctures now. We've lost about 30% of our total. If we're careful, if we don't encounter headwinds, if we don't have to maneuver violently, we might make it to Iwo. Iwo Jima it is, then." Jim banked slightly south, adjusting course. "Navigator, new heading for Iwo." "Heading 192, Pierce responded. "Distance 400 miles. Time to Iwo, 3 hours, 10 minutes. The fighters made 2 more passes, but they were getting low on ammunition and fuel themselves. After the last pass, they broke off, climbing back toward their bases. Devil's Daughter flew on alone, wounded, bleeding fuel, carrying 1 dead crew member and 10 exhausted, traumatized survivors. The next 2 hours were a blur of monitoring gauges, nursing the engines, fighting the constant urge to close his eyes and sleep. The oxygen deprivation had left them all with splitting headaches and bone-deep exhaustion. Hayes flew on autopilot. Literally, the mechanical system handling most of the flying while they watched, made tiny corrections, kept the aircraft in the air through sheer will. At 0347 hours, Pierce called out, "I've got Iwo Jima on radar. Bearing 095, distance 40 miles. 40 miles. 40 miles to salvation." But the fuel gauges read nearly empty. The engines were running rough, starved for gasoline, coughing and sputtering. "We're not going to make it," Palmer said quietly. "Captain, we need to ditch or bail out." "No. While we still have altitude." Jim looked ahead. In the darkness, he could just barely make out the shape of Iwo Jima, a tiny volcanic island in the vast Pacific. Mount Suribachi rising from one end. And on the flat part of the island, invisible in the darkness but burned into his memory from the briefing maps, 2 runways. Captured Japanese runways now being used by American aircraft. "I can make it," Jim said. "Captain." "I can make it." Number 2 engine coughed, missed, coughed again. The fuel flow gauge read 0. "Number 2 flaming out," Palmer announced. The propeller windmilled, then stopped as Palmer feathered it. 1 engine left now. Number 1, on the far left wing, the only thing between them and the ocean. 20 miles. "Radio Iwo Tower," Jim ordered. "Tell them we're coming in emergency. 1 engine, landing straight in. No go around." "Iwo Tower, this is Devil's Daughter declaring emergency," Hayes transmitted. 1 engine, fuel exhaustion, 10 souls on board. Request emergency landing, any runway. Devil's Daughter, Iwo Tower. Runway 28 is cleared. All other traffic is holding. You are number 1. Good luck. 10 miles. The number 1 engine coughed. "No, no, no," Palmer breathed. "Don't quit on us now, baby. Don't quit." Jim pushed the nose down, trading altitude for distance. They were at 4,000 feet. Glide slope to the island. If the engine quit now, they'd have 1 shot. Glide in, dead stick landing in the darkness on an unfamiliar runway. 5 miles. 2,000 feet. The engine ran smooth again, fed by the last drops of gasoline in the tank. 3 miles. 1,000 feet. Jim could see the runway now, marked by lights, a strip of salvation carved into the volcanic rock. 2 miles. 500 feet. The engine coughed. Caught. Coughed again. 1 mile. "Gear down," Jim ordered. Hayes pulled the lever. The landing gear dropped, locked. The additional drag slowed them further. Half mile. 200 feet. The engine quit. The propeller windmilled in the slipstream. No power, just metal spinning in the wind. The aircraft descended in eerie near silence, just the whistle of wind over damaged aluminum and the ragged breathing of 10 terrified men. Jim had 1 chance. Too high and they'd overshoot, stall, crash beyond the runway. Too low and they'd hit short, slam into the rocks before the runway. He flew it like he'd flown nothing before in his life. Every lesson, every hour of training, every instinct honed over 28 missions coming together in this single approach. The runway lights passed on either side. The wheels hit volcanic rock. Devil's Daughter bounced, hard. The damaged tail section groaned. The aircraft came down again, stayed down, rolled. Jim stood on the brakes. The aircraft slowed, slower, slower. They stopped 500 feet from the end of the runway. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Then Hayes began to laugh, a sound somewhere between hysteria and relief. Palmer was crying. Someone in back was praying. Jim shut down the remaining systems, his hands moving by muscle memory. Then he just sat there, staring at nothing, feeling everything. They'd made it. 10 of them. Junior hadn't. The debriefing happened at dawn. Jim and his crew sat in a tent on Iwo Jima, wrapped in blankets, drinking coffee that tasted like heaven. A colonel from intelligence listened as Jim recounted the mission, the fighter attack, the oxygen system failure, the decision to continue, the losses, the desperate flight home. When Jim finished, the colonel was quiet for a moment. Then, "Captain, you know you had the authority to abort. Turn back. Get your crew out safely." "Yes, sir." "Why didn't you?" Jim looked at his crew: Hayes, Palmer, Pierce, Mitchum, Rizzo, Kowalski, DeLuca, Ray Bishop, and the empty space where Junior should have been. "Because if we'd turned back alone, we'd have been killed by fighters. And because the mission mattered. And because—" Jim paused. "Because I made a call. I thought it was the right one. I still think it was the right one. But I'll have to live with the cost." The colonel nodded slowly. The Mitsubishi plant in Nagoya was destroyed. 40% of the city burned. It'll take months before they can produce aircraft again. Your bombs hit the target. Your mission succeeded. "Yes, sir," Jim said. His voice was hollow. 3 days later, Devil's Daughter was declared unsalvageable, too damaged to repair, too dangerous to fly. She was stripped for parts and scrapped. Jim Cartwright flew 7 more missions before the war ended in August. He never lost another crew member. But Junior's death stayed with him, in his dreams, in quiet moments, in the space between heartbeats. Years later, when people asked him about the war, he'd tell them about the night Devil's Daughter flew for hours with her oxygen system destroyed, about the impossible decisions and the thin line between heroism and survival. He'd tell them that war wasn't about glory. It was about young men doing impossible things in impossible circumstances, and sometimes, just sometimes, living to tell about it. But he'd always end the story the same way. "We made it home. 10 of us. We did our job. We survived." A pause. Junior didn't. And that's the part I'll never forget. The price of survival, he learned that night over the Pacific, wasn't just measured in fuel and oxygen and bullet holes. It was measured in the weight of decisions made in seconds, carried for a lifetime. And some debts, no matter how necessary, can never fully be repaid.